The people of Israel have a fascinating historical story. Last week we were talking about the forefathers of Israel, particularly Jacob. So there's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, then Jacob's 12 sons, the tribes of Israel, and they become a people. We're going to fast forward this week to the prophet Elijah. In between those two stories, a lot has happened, and in particular, a lot of geopolitical infighting between the Israelites has happened. The first king that Israel has is Saul. He's a member of the tribe of Benjamin. Then David becomes king, and David is really the pinnacle of the history of Israel. He has a son named Solomon who becomes king, and things start fracturing under Solomon in spite of his wisdom. And so they break into two nations, the people of Israel. This was never God's plan, never God's design. God, in fact, pretty well warned that this thing could happen if they sought after a king. And so this picture here is a picture of Judah and Israel. It's a little bit stretched because we had to get it on here. So it's a little narrower and a little smaller. But Israel on top is 10 of the tribes, and Judah on the bottom is 2 of the tribes. And they're at war with each other for many different reasons, some that trace back to Jacob and his 12 sons. But most specifically and most recently is that people were really ticked at how Solomon was taxing them as king. And so his taxing the people led to a final rift that led to the splitting of the two nations. Now, it's hard to read the cities here, but right along the top of the purple is the city of Jerusalem, off to the right just a little bit. Jerusalem is the capital of the people of God. It's where the temple is. If you are going to worship properly in ancient Judaism, you will go to the temple to offer sacrifices, to spend time honoring God. And when the two nations split, Israel is no longer welcome in Judah, and so they can no longer come and worship. So they create all sorts of problems in the northern kingdom. All the way up in the far northwest corner is Mount Carmel on the little hump there into the Mediterranean Sea. They build an altar for the Lord there, but it's unsatisfying to God. The kings of Israel, unable to worship properly in Jerusalem, create all sorts of altars all over the place that are unsatisfying to God. And when they find that they can't satisfy God because they can't bring their people to the temple, it opens them up to all sorts of idolatry and people coming in to worship false gods. Many of those kings, all kings of Israel are considered inept or poor kings because they can't lead their people in worship, which was the call of the king. Judah, however, had its own struggles, ups and downs with kings, but they were in better shape because they had Jerusalem, and so the people there worshiped well, and they attended to the call of God on the people to go and offer their sacrifices for atonement and such in the temple. Israel is where our story that we're going to tell today about Elijah is set. The story of Elijah is really a story of Elijah and King Ahab and his wife Jezebel. Now, Jezebel, that's probably a name that sticks out to you, maybe even more so than King Ahab. Jezebel was considered trouble in the Old Testament, to say the least. And the trouble that she brings is a particularly Israelite trouble. She may not have been so problematic if she had married another king from another nation, but she did what she knew to do. She was a Canaanite woman from Sidon, and she worshiped Baal. Baal is a false god that is a huge problem in the Old Testament that makes regular appearances as problematic for the Israelite people. King Ahab was very into Jezebel, so he married her, even though it was against the law. He was not supposed to marry foreign women. And as soon as he married her, he brought her into the nation and allowed her to bring all of her culture with her. And so she worshiped Baal and Asherah, and up went Asherah poles worshiping Asherah, and up went all sorts of shrines and worship centers for Baal all over Israel, the northern kingdom. And so God is very upset that his people now are not only not worshiping in Jerusalem, where they belong in the temple, but now they're also worshiping idols and false gods. This is the scene into which Elijah walks. Now, I don't know about you, but I love a good origin story. The Bible loves a good origin story too. All over the scripture, there is Isaac is announced to Sarah, Samuel to Hannah, John the Baptist to both of his parents, Jesus to both of his parents. In our culture, we love origin stories as well. Batman's parents are shot. Spider-Man is bit by a spider. Superman is ejected from a planet far off and lands on Earth. In our history, we love origin stories as well. People flock to Grant's farm to see where Ulysses Grant came from. Lincoln's small beginnings in both Kentucky and Illinois have people gathering there. Jimmy Carter has people visiting his peanut farm. John McCain recently passed as a senator, and the story of his life couldn't be told without his emerging to national prominence by being held captive in Vietnam and being unwilling to use his privilege to get out early. We love origin stories, and where people come from so often tells us a lot about who they are. Elijah's origin story is one of the most bizarre origin stories in all of the scriptures. We're not given a birth. We're not given a childhood. He appears on the scene because he's hungry, and he gets fed by ravens. That's a bizarre start to his story. Ravens were considered deeply unclean animals in Israelite law. And so the idea here that some holy man would come onto the scene without an announcement and having the dirtiest and most filthy and disgusting birds coming to his aid and feeding him day by night that he might survive, this should set off all sorts of alarms in our head. Something is wrong with this dude. Nothing, huh? Something's wrong with this dude, guys. This is crazy. We would almost want to read this story and say, can we trust this guy who would eat from the feet of ravens? And yet the story continues because the power of the Lord is with him, and it's evident. See, later on, there's a drought that comes. And the irony of this drought across the land is that the God that Israel is serving, Baal, is the storm god, the god in Canaanite pagan culture who brings rain and therefore brings life. If there is a drought, Canaanite people know to blame Baal and to pray to Baal and pray that Baal, their god, would come and bring rain. And so the fact that there's a drought brings extra irony to this story. Elijah is being called out to go and face up against Baal, and Baal is being worshipped in God's land, but Baal is not doing what Baal is supposed to do. Israel has lost their vision of God and listened to Jezebel's vision of Baal because they're desperate to end their drought. Now, you might just recognize yourself in that piece of the story. You see, we know that God is God of everything, the creator of heavens and earth, but when we have a very specific problem, we have a tendency to take it into our own hand or try to leverage the thing that's closest and easiest for us to get at in order to leverage for us what we need that we think God won't provide for us. We get scheming, we get manipulating, we try the things of this world in order to fill the holes that we have in our life. And Israel is very guilty of this at this point. Why pray to their God when they can pray to a very specific God who apparently is in control of the very specific thing they need? Rain to end their drought. Elijah goes to the hometown of Jezebel in the midst of this drought. It's very important that we see that this strange, bizarre, fed by ravens man isn't just wandering aimlessly, but walks to the very place that Queen Jezebel is from. And he goes and he finds the poorest of the poor in this town. And he goes up to this widow who has a son. We know that widows in ancient time were considered the most destitute, unable to care for themselves, and lowest class people in society. He goes to a widow and says, "Hey lady, could you take care of me?" Now, if you need care taken of you, you don't go to a widow. Widows can't take care of you. They don't have income, they have limited resources. And the lady knows this very much and says, "Listen, I can't help you, dude. I've got just enough oil and flour to make one more piece of bread. We're going to make that bread, We're going to eat some sticks, and then my son and I are going to go die. This is what the Bible says. And Elijah says, listen, you take me in, and I promise you'll live a long life. Well, that's a gamble she's willing to take. She has this strange man from a different religion, from a different nation, knocking on her door, but it's the best chance she has to go on. So she welcomes Elijah into her house. And with just her little drops of oil and her little bit of flour, she begins making bread. Day after day after day after day. And every day there's still enough to make bread that they would eat. And the son and the widow and Elijah are all satisfied and filled. In spite of the drought, in spite of the lack of resources, they thrive in the face of the drought that the God of this woman, Baal, can't seem to figure out on her own. We're starting to get hints that Elijah is representing a God that's bigger than the God, Baal. Little hints. And then from there, the boy, the widow's one pride and joy, the one thing she has to live for, he dies. And she marches right up to Elijah, and you can imagine why she would be suspicious of him. Again, she's not Israelite. She does not worship Yahweh. She worships Baal. And she's invited this Yahweh prophet into her house, and now she believes her gods are coming back at her. And so she goes and she shoves Elijah and says, "Who are you? You come into my house and take the one thing I have. Why would you do this to me?" And Elijah says, "I'll take care of him." And so he goes and he grabs the boy. And he prays to God over the boy and yearns that God would come and let this boy's life return to him. And we're told in 17:22 that the Lord heard Elijah's cry. And the boy returned to life. And he brought the child to the woman and said, "Look, here is your son." And the woman says, "Finally, after being fed for all this time, now I know that you are a man of God and that the word of the Lord comes from your mouth. And that it is true." And so now we have this scene set where Elijah is not just a prophet with a word, but he's also a man of miraculous power. We know that God is doing something in Elijah. And what it is, we've got to be kind of ready, on our toes, waiting to see what's going to happen next. And the what happens next is one of the most wild, climactic stories in the entire Old Testament. The word of God comes to Elijah again and says, "Go and confront Ahab." Now that's bad news if you're a prophet. That's scary news because Ahab has armies. Ahab has power. For all that he's doing wrong, he probably even to some degree has the people on his side. And so Elijah now probably feels incredibly lonely. It's me and God against my whole nation. And so he walks towards Ahab, terrified of what's going to happen, and he runs into instead Obadiah. Obadiah is a counselor of Ahab. He's someone in Ahab's inner circle. And when Elijah runs into him, Obadiah says, "Oh, great. Now we're in trouble. What are you doing here, dude?" And he says, "I'm looking for King Ahab. Can you go find him for me?" And Obadiah is like, "We don't want any trouble, buddy. You know I'm on your side. Ahab's a little nuts. He's kind of ruined the country. But I really don't want to see you killed. I really don't want to see any violence. Could we just avoid this whole thing?" And God says, "No, I need to see Ahab." And Obadiah says, "Listen, if I go back to King Ahab and say, 'Hey, buddy, I've seen Elijah. He's in the country,' and then you don't show your face, guess who's going to be? Me! You better show up if I go back and tell him." And Elijah says, "I'll tell you when and where, and I'll meet him, and I'll be there." And so Obadiah goes back and tells Ahab that Elijah is in town, and the two of them meet up with one another, and they agree on a duel, a battle on the top of Mount Carmel. Again, in what I showed you earlier, Mount Carmel is far in the northeast corner, a long way from Jerusalem. It's a place that the people of Israel had set up an altar to Yahweh, that they could try and worship him there as if it would be as satisfying as in the temple. But it had fallen into complete ruins. Elijah knows what he's setting up here. He's going to a place that is in ruins, it's destitute, and it's a place where it seems as though Baal is winning. And he invites Ahab to bring all of the prophets of Baal that he could bring, and the battle and the fight will be just this, that we each call on our God to light a fire without us lighting the fire ourselves. I'll even let Baal's prophets go first. And so Ahab agrees to the deal, and they all climb to the top of Mount Carmel. And all of the prophets of Baal set up this lovely and wonderful pit where a fire could burn. And so Elijah says, I tell you what, you go first. I'll just sit here and watch. And the prophets of Baal, they start doing dances and calling out to their God. 450 of them circling around the fire. And Elijah yells out to him. He starts taunting him. Hey, guys, maybe your God's asleep. If you yell a little louder, he might hear you and stir from his slumber. I mean, can you imagine this one dude talking trash at 450 different prophets? He's just laying back talking junk. And so they dance louder and they cry louder and we're told like they take swords and start cutting themselves to prove to Baal how much they'll suffer for him. And Elijah just keeps taunting them. Hey, you're non-omnipotent God. He probably just took a pill. He's getting his snooze on. Just a little louder, and surely he'll start that fire that you said he could start. Nothing happens all morning long. And the people are just embarrassed, and now they're bleeding. And Elijah says, well, I guess I'll take my turn now. And so he says, listen, can you, I'm gonna take this shrine, this fire pit, this altar that you've built to Yahweh, and I'm gonna rebuild it. Can you guys go find some water? I know it's dry, but just find some water for me. And so he builds up the altar. He says, pour all that water onto this altar. And so they douse the altar that's supposed to be lit on fire. And Elijah says, no, not good enough. Go find some more water. And they douse it one more time. He says, that's still not enough. One more time. Bring a third. And they douse it. It's now waterlogged. There's water all over the ground and floor everywhere. In the wood that Yahweh is supposed to light on fire is absolutely dripping and soaking. I don't know if you've ever been camping before, but when you grab the wet logs from out in the wilderness, it does not sustain and light on fire. Elijah has not thought this through tactically, apparently. After watching Baal's prophets all morning not even be able to get a spark, he has put himself at even more of a disadvantage. And he reaches out to Yahweh and calls upon Yahweh and says, Lord, you know that there are few of us left. You know that the people have turned their back, but show that you are God and bring down fire upon this altar. And as you can see in the picture, the heavens open and fire descends and the altar lights on fire. And Elijah orders the 450 priests to be captured by the people of Israel, and all the Baal priests are slaughtered. And Ahab knows he has lost. The God he has led Israel to worship has turned the back on the God who can bring fire. And he has turned to a powerless God who can't even be bothered to be woken up. And Ahab is destitute. He runs and takes off, and he goes into his room, and he shuts the door like a 13-year-old teenager and begins to wail and weep with Jezebel on the outside. What's wrong? Tell me what's happened. What's going on out there? Why is the king crying like a baby? And Ahab lets Jezebel in and tells all about it. The fire from heaven, the drenched altar, the 450 Baal prophets slaughtered. And Jezebel swears one thing. She will not be embarrassed like this. She will have Elijah's head. And so Elijah gets word of this, and he takes off. We're told he travels 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb. Now, if you know any of your Old Testament, this should sound off alarm bells for you. Mount Horeb is where Moses saw the burning bush. Mount Horeb is what Moses climbed in order to get the 10 Commandments and the law. And he was up there for 40 days and 40 nights. This is a powerful place of God. And the imagery and the hearkening back should tell us exactly what's going on here. Elijah is going to a place that he knows God is deeply present. He goes to a place where he knows that God has been at work in the past. He goes to a place where he knows the presence of God is thick, and he takes the time to get there that it took Moses on top of the mountain. And so Elijah climbs to the top of the mountain seeking God. We can probably identify with this piece of the story as well. When things are tough, when we face tension, when we're broken, we have a certain way of retreating into the past instead of climbing on into the future. We don't press ahead when we're struggling. We don't look for God in what's happening and in the struggle. So often we retreat from what's in front of us, and we find solace and comfort in what God did yesterday instead of walking faithfully into what God is going to do now. And so Elijah goes back into the history books. He climbs to the top and he seeks God. And the good news is that even when we retreat, God answers prayer. God finds us. God speaks. And Elijah, in all of his fear of being put to death, in all of his loneliness, and all of his brokenness, he finds God in the same place that Moses found God. And God speaks very clear and fascinating words to Elijah. These words are found in 1 Kings chapter 19. And we're going to read from verse 9 to verse 18. If you would join me in standing as we read the word of the Lord, it'll be on the screen here. You can follow in your own scriptures. 1 Kings 19, starting with verse 9. And the word of the Lord came to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? He replied, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, broken down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left. And now they're trying to kill me too. The Lord said, Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. Another translation says, a still small voice. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, What are you doing here, Elijah? He replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, broken down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. The Lord said to him, Go back the way you came, and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king of Israel, and anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel Meholah, to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and all whose mouths have not kissed him. The word of the Lord. Amen. You may be seated. I had the good fortune of moving during middle school. It's not good fortune at all. I moved between 7th and 8th grade from the state of Louisiana to the state of Wisconsin. Eventually, hopefully you'll be able to catch up with all my wild moving stories from when I was a kid. I moved between 7th and 8th grade from Louisiana to Wisconsin. When I was in Louisiana, I was I was on all the baseball teams. I was on school volleyball teams. I was kind of a cool kid, kind of in the middle of all that was happening. Life was pretty comfortable and simple and easy for me. I had a great time in school. I loved middle school. If my middle school experience had ended there, I would have no idea what you all were talking about when you said middle school is tough. It was easy. I had a great time. I loved school. I loved people. I loved the way my life was organized. And then my dad got the faithful news that we were being transferred to Wisconsin from winters of 60 degrees to winters of negative 60 degrees. And we moved right in the middle of middle school, and I went to a new school, and everything about that experience was terrible. It was awful. It was a different place where people made fun of me. I didn't have any friends like I had before, and all of the friend groups were already pretty solidified when I got there. And to top it all off, I had this just brutally awful accent that was kind of half Boston, half Deep South. I don't know how to describe it to you except that I couldn't say a single word without people trying to mimic what I said, making fun of everything that came out of my mouth. I remember one day that my backpack was sitting under my desk, and the girl behind me took it, and they started pulling everything out of my bag and started handing it all around the classroom until I had nothing left. I was miserable. I hated every single day. It was the only time I ever asked my mom to put me in a different school. I hated everything about life, and it was probably the closest I've ever come in my life to outright depression. Waking up in the morning and going to school was absolutely brutal. Now, by the time I got to 9th grade and went to high school, it all changed and it was all okay. It was just really 1 year. But something was happening behind the scenes that when I would wake up on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, that I didn't notice because of how much the struggle in front of me was. And that was, I had gone to a new church as well. And in this church, for the first time, I had a youth pastor. And I saw for the first time fellow teenagers, middle school and high school, who were serious about their faith. And they wanted to gather together on Sunday and Wednesday to talk about what they were reading in the scriptures and about how God was at work in their lives. And so, while my church experience before then had always been good, this was the first time where I thought that peers were as serious or more serious than me about following Christ. And so in the midst of what was the loneliest period of my entire life, the hardest, most treacherous period, I would have 2 or 3 times a week where I would gather with the saints of the church. And those times weren't just okay, they were excellent. And I was developing friends that are still my friends today, that I met in church of all places. And they were calling me, just by the way that they lived their lives, to something bigger and better. And what I found, and I could testify to with all of my heart, is that even when you or I are lonely, we're given the gift of the church. That even when in the dark moments in between Sundays and we're left alone and we feel alone, Sunday's coming. And when we gather in a room like this, we do the good work, not just of receiving, but also giving. And it was teenagers. Teenagers are supposed to be awful. But it was teenagers who saved me, not only for God, but for myself. It was friends in a place like a church that gave me hope to make it from week to week to week until the worst situation, the lonely times, got better. This is, in many ways, the story of Elijah as well. He does the most powerful thing, maybe the most powerful thing in the whole Old Testament, calling down fire from heaven onto waterlogged logs and lights them on fire. If you want to know that God is near you, if you can call down fire from heaven onto waterlogged logs, you know God is near you. And yet, Elijah is lonely and broken. And he goes off to Mount Horeb just to complain to God, to say, I'm all alone. Sometimes we think if God will do big things in our lives, that'll make everything okay. But the testimony of Elijah is exactly the opposite. He was not okay, and God was doing some wild, miraculous things for him and around him and through him. And Elijah was still not okay. And so, in the midst of this time, God says, I tell you what, I'll show up. Go stand on the side of the mountain. And God starts doing some wild things, earthquakes and winds and fire. And God is not in any of this. Elijah got to see a show, but surely he's like, speak, God, tell me what is next. And finally, we're told that God's voice comes in a whisper. This is really important stuff right here. We're so often looking for fire from heaven. Elijah gets it, and it's not enough. But God speaks in a whisper in the midst of earthquake and thunder and lightning and wind. It's the whisper in the midst of the chaos when God's voice shows up. And Elijah gets to respond to the whisper. I'm all alone, God. I'm the only one left. I'm lonely. And God answers the prayer not by saying, hey, I'll make it all better for you. But he answers the prayer by giving him a few people to anoint and mentor, and the promise that there are 7,000 people left in Israel who are worshiping like he does. So, well, that's not a very good answer, is it? Okay, Elijah, you're all alone. Go make some friends. That's not how God works, right? God always does everything for me so that my life is easy. I guess not, huh? We live in the most connected world in the history of civilization, and also the loneliest world in the history of civilization. Now, how bizarre is that? That you have friends that you don't even like in your cell phone that you could text right now so that you're not alone. And yet there's a deep, deep sense of loneliness in our world. What a contradiction that is. What a strange place to find ourselves at this particular moment. I imagine there are people in this room right now that if we could just take some true serum and be honest, would raise their hand and say, I am at my loneliest that I've ever been. I feel alone in parenting. I feel alone in grandparenting. I feel alone at work. I'm struggling. God says to Elijah when he says, I'm the only one, it's just me. God gives Elijah a task to fill his time with. And one of those things that I really want to point out to you is he calls him to mentor Elisha, the next prophet. That's God's antidote to loneliness. Is not go find someone who will make you better, but take your brokenness, take your hurt, take your loneliness, and bring it alongside someone who you can build up. And those two become buddies. They're inseparable in their story, Elijah and Elisha. Elijah goes, God's antidote to him is to go find someone like-minded and mentor him, that he will be a prophet like you for Israel when you go away. Now, that's kind of backwards from how we think. We're always thinking we need someone to come and fix us, someone to come and mentor us, someone to lift us up. But God's call in this story is go anoint some kings and go find someone to mentor. And this is the last we hear of Elijah's loneliness. From now on, he has a buddy. He has someone to live life with. He can share his experiences and his stories, and he hands off the ministry to Elisha, to the point that Elijah's story ends with a chariot coming in fire from heaven and picking Elijah up and taking him off to heaven. Elijah doesn't even have a death story, let alone an origin story. And his leaving is so confusing that when John the Baptist comes along in a few centuries, people just assume that John the Baptist is Elijah because he never died anyways, right? He had to be somewhere. But the story is when Elijah takes off, he takes off his cloak and throws it down to Elisha. And Elisha is mad that his mentor is gone, and so he puts on his clothes, and some wild things begin happening. Waters start parting, just crazy stuff. And then people notice that Elisha is different when he puts on Elijah's clothes. And they begin to testify that the spirit of Elijah is now resting on Elisha. and the power of God's work through prophets continues. I don't know if you're struggling with loneliness today. I don't know if you're struggling with call. I don't know if you're struggling to know where God is. But God's promise is so powerful in this story that even though you don't see it, God is at work in other people's lives around you. God is present and near even if we don't have eyes to see what God is up to. And God's call upon our life, I think, that we can learn from this story is, in the midst of loneliness, find and make connection. Don't wait for connection to come to you, but be intentional. And don't be afraid to be intentional about finding someone who's behind you and using your struggle to build them up and bring them along with you. What would the church look like today if instead of embracing loneliness and saying that's just the way it is, we developed a culture of mentorship and friendship and connectedness inside of us? What would happen if when we wake up on Sunday morning, we don't judge whether or not we should go to church based on how I feel? I'm tired, I'm feeling sick, I'm not going to have it today. But what if instead we woke up and thought, maybe someone needs me? Maybe I can be a minister. Maybe I can take my brokenness and my weariness and my loneliness and find some sort of connection that builds someone else up. Maybe what God is doing is building empathy within me and not brokenness. What would happen if, like Elijah, we took our loneliness and gave it to God and received from God instructions of where to go, what to do, and how to be a minister in the midst of a world that's lonely? The band is going to come out and sing a final song as we worship. We're going to sing Amazing Grace together, a recollection that God's grace is amazing even in the hard times. And if you're wondering where you fit in terms of this story of loneliness, this struggle that Elijah has, maybe it identified you all too well. We're going to allow you and invite you to come forward and pray today and seek that God would speak to you. And I invite you that as you pray, you don't look for fire from heaven or earthquakes, but be attentive to a whisper that God would speak to you and call you into a place that stretches you into meaning. As we sing, would you join me in standing as we worship and conclude?
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. My chains are gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior has ransomed me, and like a flood, His mercy reigns, unending love, amazing grace. dissolve like snow. The sun forbid to shine, but God who called me here below will be forever mine. Will be forever mine. You are forever mine.
As you prepare to go from this place today, as you head out into a world struggling with loneliness, I invite you in this blessing to recognize that you are the called and sent ones of God. You, as the church, are God's plan for the salvation of the world. So as you go from this place today and head into a world that's lonely and hurting, recognize the presence of God and call upon your life to bring wholeness through you. Through you. You are God's hands and feet in this world. Receive that call and go, not as a person just being dismissed, but a person sent to see that the world would be saved through your words and your life and your testimony. Go and be the hands and feet of Christ to this world.